Welcome to Popcorn Talk, featuring movie discussion, news, and interviews. Popcorn Talk. We talk movies. And now, here's Popcorn Talk's Anatomy of a Movie.
Wow, look at that. On the piano, Mr. Ryan J. Nilsson in the booth. Hello, and welcome to a retro Anatomy of a Movie. I am Christian Bladt, joined by the lovely Rachel Goodman.
Hey, I am really excited to be here and to talk about Snowpiercer.
Yeah, obviously we chose this film because of the Academy Award nominations, and in some cases lack thereof, for Bong Joon-Ho. It was nominated, Parasite was nominated for Best Film.
And not only that, but we just had the SAG Awards this past weekend, and the Ensemble won for Best Performance.
Yeah. So, it's right there in the zeitgeist. And I had heard of this film, but since we're talking about it here, it means that we hadn't seen it. I had no idea what it was about. I did, when I clicked on Netflix, I did see what the summary was. If it wasn't for that summary, though, I would have started it and been like, I don't know what's going on.
Yeah.
So I was just like, okay, it's a cool premise. How much did you know about this movie before you started watching it?
I knew that Bong Joon-Ho was the director. I knew that Chris Evans was the star. I didn't even watch a trailer for Snowpiercer.
I don't remember seeing one.
Yeah, I don't either. It could be, but 2013 was a long time ago at this point. But I just remember that's it. Those are the only two things I really knew.
Let me check in with our producer in the booth, Ryan. You, of course, did know this film because you pointed out to us that you owned it.
Oh, yes.
How was this film on your radar? Where you just, how did you know about this film? I mean, we had heard of it. We just didn't watch it.
Yes. Well, again, Ryan, senior producer here at Popcorn Talk. I was a big fan of this film. I heard about it coming out because around 2013, that's when I was kind of going to a big deep dive with movies. And that's actually the first time I ever became aware of who Bong Joon-Ho even was.
Yeah.
So this was the first film I saw of his, and then I went back and I actually watched a few of his others. But I knew he was big in Korean cinema, and it was weird to think that, hey, there's a Korean a filmmaker making an American film. So I became really attracted to the idea. Also, Chris Evans, I only knew him from Captain America and his other superhero movies. I wanted to see him in a different role, and we got that in this, and it didn't disappoint. I bought it immediately.
I love that. Yeah. Let's give a shout out to buying physical media and actually owning films and having them on a shelf.
I actually have it on digital HD, but yes.
Okay, so you don't own it.
I remember that.
So you bought it that way. I still have it. Look, I like to look at them sometimes.
Yeah. Well,
but see, at least you bought it. But a lot of times people assume that these movies are going to stay on the streaming service that they find them on, and then it's like, hey, where did those go?
And I think it's interesting too, kind of speaking on Ryan, how you were saying you knew about the director already. Bong Joon-Ho had actually he had some very successful hits by 2013 already, especially for anyone living in Korea. He was a known director. So,
but you mentioned specifically a film called Mother, right?
Mother was from 2009.
2009. Okay.
2006 was The Host.
Oh yeah, right. Which I did see, by the way.
Yeah,
and I do remember that movie, and that was this, everybody was talking about, oh, it's so crazy. There's this movie, this Korean movie, you have to check it out. And so I did see it, and somehow, I don't know, I'm going to blame the media for it, but I wasn't aware of what he was up to after that. I didn't do the deep dive. I didn't do my homework like Ryan did.
Well, it's interesting, too, because The Host had two of the same actors that ended up in Snowpiercer.
Right.
The actor Song Kang-ho, who's also in Parasite, he was in The Host, and also Yona, who plays his daughter in Snowpiercer, Go Ah-sung, she was in The Host as well. So they were both in Snowpiercer and The Host.
Song Kang-ho is basically Bong Joon-ho's Leonardo DiCaprio, he is for Quentin Tarantino.
Or
it's I'm just going to put you in everything.
Exactly. Or Martin Scorsese's,
Wow. His little cast of characters.
3 or 4 people.
Yeah, and look, I think it's great because, first of all, they're great. Everybody's great in this movie. I think you have some great performances from children, and that's always a roll of the dice, As I have 2 children, just trying to get them to do anything. I can't imagine trying to give them stage directions. And no, this time with feeling, So let's talk a little bit about the background of the movie and how it was received. Obviously, we had both heard of it, so we knew that there was at least some buzz of this movie, but we didn't know much. It is based on a French graphic novel, and my French is impeccable. So why are you laughing?
I want to
You just-
hear this. You want to try saying it?
La Transpercengère, which did not sound like the way in my head it sounded like concierge. But yeah, so and I assume that's Snowpiercer. So I think that's always kind of interesting. And then keeping the multinational theme, it was filmed in the Czech Republic, so it's a South Korean Czech co-production. And that's interesting for a movie that is 80% in English.
Yeah.
Is that, it's not really an American production. Obviously when it comes to distribution and all that stuff, but for what we can say about Harvey Weinstein now is a lot different than we talk about his business acumen and the knowledge of which films to acquire. And this was planned to be a very small release sort of a film. And usually when Harvey got behind a movie, it made a lot of money, gets nominated for awards, which we'll talk about in a little bit. And the greatest little tidbit that I saw about it was that it was produced on a budget of $40 million, which to this day, the most expensive Korean budget ever for a film is $40 million. And that is a lot of money. I'm not saying that's not a lot of money, but I mean, when you think of the movies that we see here in the U.S., I'm pretty sure the catering budget is $40 million. I saw the budget. I can't talk about a lot of it, but I saw every line in the Star Trek Into Darkness budget, and I was like, what are they spending?
Well, and on top of that too, they included star cast. So Chris Evans alone probably was a good chunk of money to hire him for this.
Look, you're going to figure that these are all people who took a pay cut, to do a film that they thought was unique and it's interesting. And let's give credit to this movie. Yes, it's adapted from a prior work, but it's a written work, and it's a very inventive idea.
Yeah, and it's interesting too because now they've actually gone on to. They had the graphic novel in French. Now they have it in English, and they've kind of adapted it after the movie. So there's like a couple of them now, at least. So, but it's interesting.
Yeah, and when I saw what the concept was, I think that's great. And we sort of get that voiceover at the beginning of the film where they start talking about it's like, well, we're gonna cool the global temperature. And look, when you think about the fact that we're the human race, you just know that we're going to find a way to mess that up. Like we're going to cool everything down. Whoops, cooled it down a little too much, didn't we? And now we're dead.
And
honestly, that's so us. That's so and that's not an American thing. That's us as humans. We just can't do anything right.
The thing I thought was hilarious too in that opening sequence, as they're kind of showing us what happened. Yeah, we see a car that says it has like a little thing hanging, like I don't know what you call it, but something hanging from the rear view mirror. Yeah, basically saying save the planet, but it's all frozen over. Yeah. I was like, okay, that's kind of funny.
Yeah, well, it's very funny. It's like, if only they'd listened. Yeah. Somebody should have listened. So if the idea ever comes about to lower our global temperature to combat global warming,
do not use CW7.
I will see what I can do about getting on one of those Richard Branson rockets into space, because it's not going to end well. This was just a logical conclusion, but as we sort of we set up the situation and we get to know the characters, what are you thinking about this movie just as you're watching it? Just some of your initial thoughts.
So because of how I went into this, because I am a huge fan of Bong Joon-Ho at this point, I was looking at it from a filmmaker's perspective. And so the first thing I noticed is that they bring us into this world. They show us what's going on without really directly telling us. There's no character really that just comes out and says it in those opening moments. You just kind of have to figure, okay, this is what happened. And they really utilize like news archives to kind of fill in the blanks so that we weren't completely confused. Yeah. And then when we met Chris Evans's character, the first thing we get is that, okay, they're like, we get the premise from the very second we meet him that it's these people who, have the crappy end of the stick. They're in the final, car, and they are about to start an uprising.
Yeah. Yeah, and here's the thing. Obviously, we learn a lot about Curtis's character as the movie goes along, especially, the third act. We learn a little bit about his past. But as a leader and sort of a never say die, no quit sort of a thing, it's like, oh, it's nice to see him playing someone other than Captain America, but he's kind of Captain America in this. You know what I mean? There's no stopping him as far just that level of determination, and sure he doubts whether he's the right person or any of that, but it's like he won't admit that he's a leader, but it's very clear to everyone else that he is.
So I agree with you in the sense that I think he's a leader, but I also didn't feel like he was Captain America. Because so my thing is that one of the things I loved about Curtis is that he had been part of, I don't want to say problem lately, because it's not like the people were a problem, but it was part of this idea that if you were put in a bad situation, you're going to do corrupt things too, including eating babies. And that was one of the things that we end up finding out with Curtis, is that not only was he part of eating the weak, he would actually kill people in order to eat them or to eat their child or to, just to have a meal. And that's one of the things, is that we get this conflict in him, obviously near the end, but like, to me, it really made this character very multi-dimensional. And I appreciated that we didn't just get a typical hero. This is a hero who, in his mind, he was not the hero because he was flawed from the beginning. And they hint at it too, especially with Gilliam saying, you're not the same person anymore. So it's been hinted at. Yeah, and I appreciated that. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, let's talk about some of the rest of the cast. You mentioned Gilliam. Very nice to see the War Doctor here. John Hurt, who, of course, has a very lengthy IMDb page, but I immediately was excited. Like, oh my God, it's the War Doctor from Doctor Who.
And they said, when I was looking this up, the reason why John Hurt was cast was because Bong Joon-Ho had seen him in The Elephant Man, and knew from then he wanted to put him in something. Yeah. So I found that interesting too, to see him there.
Yeah, and I think that he is sort of that great. You have these sort of characters. This somebody that everyone looks up to but isn't really on the ground, I mean, whether all of my references tend to be in nerd stuff, but it's sort of like, your Professor Xavier in the X-Men, your captain who stays on the bridge, Jean-Luc Picard. Now I'm just sticking to bald guys played by Patrick Stewart, but you know what I'm saying? It's like, he's this guy, it's like, oh, this guy's great, but he kind of has to hang back, you know, and we find out why, but he has lost limbs, and I thought that it was a great dynamic, to have. Obviously, when somebody like Curtis doubts himself quite so much, I think having the advantage of someone that you can turn to, I think that's good. What did you think about their interactions?
I loved that the way that the dialogue was written between Gilliam and Curtis. We didn't quite get Curtis's background, and we didn't quite get Gilliam's background either. Yeah. Especially with Edgar thrown into the mix, Curtis's friend. Yeah. I mean, obviously, at first, we don't know this backstory. We don't know about Edgar's mother, but just knowing...
because we all have that friend that we killed their mother and thought about eating them. I've got a couple of friends that I considered eating at some point, but then was stopped.
Because the babies taste better.
Well, that's what I'm told.
That's what we're told in this movie. Yeah. I appreciated that Curtis had somebody to kind of live for too, that he had his father figure as well as this little brother figure who he was protecting. And it was just, I kind of figured Edgar was going to die at some point, though, because he seemed like, even though he didn't have a red shirt, he seemed like, okay, he's here, but he's not going to make the trip. And like, it became very obvious to me too, that the three of them, that this world in the back, of the train, that most of the people we were meeting were going to die.
Yeah. I don't want to say that I was convinced he was going to die, but every time he was on screen, I heard that little countdown clock from 16 minutes. A little. I'm like, it's a little bit longer. Jamie Bell is Edgar. I think he did a great job. I think that was great to see some very familiar faces in here. Who is better yet more unusual than Tilda Swinton, and what a great role for her, because obviously you got to figure everybody who's been on this train for 17 years, you're gonna, people handle it in different ways, and obviously when you're at the front of the train it's a little easier, but you're a little off because you've been on a train for 17 years.
And that's what I loved so much about this, is that every character had very, very had quirky elements to how they were, especially the further up we got. Yeah. And it just goes to show that even the people who did have the luckier position on the train, that they still weren't without their issues as well, and that the entire system was failing regardless of where you were on that train. And that's what I love so much about watching this, is this element of you're stuck on a train in a system that is not, it's going to fail at some point, but you're trapped and there's no way to really get out of it no matter where you are.
Yeah, and I mean, I think that there are elements to this story that you've certainly seen before. I mean, when you just look to the real life, which of course we saw in a film, but the sinking of the Titanic. Obviously, it's like women and children first, but also the really rich guys. Yeah. It's like, well, not exactly women and children first. Yeah. It's like, we're going to take care of the important people. And, we don't have enough boats. So, sorry. So I think to see that, and as Ed Harris's character points out, it's all by design. And I think they did a great job of foreshadowing that explanation, when they go and there's the aquarium and they explain that it's a closed ecosystem and it has, for every one new thing, you have to take one thing out. And, they only have sushi twice a year, which I can't even imagine, by the way, being any of those people from the tail section of the train and sitting down and being served sushi.
My worry was they put the wasabi in a regular, chunk next to the actual fish. And what I thought was going to happen was one of two things. I thought that she knew that they were going to eat the fish and get sick. Right. Because they had never had it before. And they were so used to that, protein bar, AKA the cockroaches.
Oh. Yeah, I of course just I went Soylent Green with that, and I'm like, oh, those protein bars are other people.
That's what I assumed too.
But I guess, as Curtis's revelation tells us, he would have enjoyed that. It's like, people do taste good, I guess. But I wasn't at all surprised that it was cockroaches. I guess I was a little bit, but I knew I knew that there was a story behind what those things were, and just how completely unappetizing they looked. Yeah. If I had been thinking, I could have made a Jell-O that looked like that, and we could have had it here on the table with us. But
do you know they actually, when I was looking this up, they went over what it really was they used?
Oh, I'd love to hear about that.
Apparently it was made from seaweed, some kind of tangle, sugar, and gelatin.
It probably didn't taste like cockroach, I'm going to guess.
No, yeah, maybe
probably
a little
tasted
better.
all right. Yeah, but just a little.
Poor Timmy.
And we have obviously a great performance from Octavia Spencer as Tanya. I think that this is good. I mean, a lot of times you don't get to see her engage in a lot of action, although I didn't see that semi-horror movie called Mom, where I guess she killed a bunch of teenagers in her basement or something, just judging from the trailer. So in general, I haven't seen her in an action role, and I thought it was very cool to see. And you can always identify with the plight, or at least I can identify with the plight of someone separated from their child. I think that's always great to have central in the story. And then we also got that from Ewan Bremner's character, who Ewan Bremner is not somebody you see all the time, but he was in Wonder Woman, and I first found him and fell in love with him as an actor as Spud in Trainspotting, and he's a great actor. Yeah. And I don't know if he just works more in overseas films, but I was very excited to see him in this movie. And
one of the things he had said, Ewan Bremner, so he of course plays Andrew, the unfortunate soul who ends up getting shot in the head. Right in I think it was in the coach where they were having the lessons with the teacher. Yes. But so his big thing was, of course he was playing a father separated from his child, and he said that he watched Mother, another Bong Joon-Ho movie, specifically so that he could kind of get the energy from that to bring toward this role. And his performance was amazing. I can't even imagine so like my big question, and this has to do with Andrew's character, was when, we had that big scene with Mason kind of near the beginning where we saw what happened when somebody put their body part outside of the window.
Yeah.
And I remember thinking, okay, so that's what happens. You have X amount of minutes and then your body, your limb kind of freezes off. And then at the end we get another reveal that kind of contradicts that. But kind of going back to this, I'm thinking it had a lot to do with the altitude and, not to kind of change what we're talking about here.
But I mean, they check. It's like, okay, we need 7 minutes at this altitude, so you get 7 minutes for a speech. Yeah, I mean, they knew where they were, they knew what it was going to take, and obviously it's all very well. They've got it all figured out up at the front section of the train.
Yeah. So I just think it's interesting because his kind of with his characters where we get the reveal that it really, like they tell us you can't go outside, but the reality is it was probably just from the altitude where the train was at that very moment.
Right, exactly. As we start to get the impression, and we'll talk about Nam in a moment, I mean, he has this idea of like, so it's cold outside, but it's not as cold as it used to be. And he, I guess, correctly assumes it's not as cold as they're telling you it is. Not everywhere. I mean, obviously, if you're driving through the Yukon in Canada, but then if you're on the train and it's Miami, it's cold because the whole world is cold, but it's going to be warmer to some extent.
And we also don't know where exactly the tracks ran. We know that they would say that it would take an entire year to go around the circle.
Yeah.
We don't know where Wilford built his track, though.
Right. Yeah, I know. And we didn't really know, like the cities to me were kind of nondescript. And I don't know if maybe one of them, was perhaps a view of a recognizable South Korean city or something, but it didn't look like Pyongyang to me either. And not that I've ever been there. So, I think that it's great. And I think that's why Nam is such a great, important character, despite the fact that he, likes to hallucinate on explosive drugs. I think it's great to have someone like that, sort of in the middle, kind of driving the story. He's like, well, I'm doing it basically because I want the drugs, but of course he has another agenda, which I think having that layer and having it revealed to us, I think obviously makes him much more interesting. What did you think of Nam on the whole?
He was one of my favorite characters. I always loved the flawed hero.
Sure.
And I think Curtis was just as flawed, but in very different ways. With Nam, what I loved about him is that he was, one, the translator device, and the fact that it wasn't working the way they expected it to.
Yeah.
And some of the time, I felt like Curtis could just kind of understand what Nam was saying without even needing that translator. So I thought that was brilliant. But then, two, just the way that he was not very forthcoming with what he was thinking. And like he would, if like, obviously I've just watched the movie once, but I'm thinking that if I go back and watch it a second time, there will be more hints that everything he says, though not direct and not, giving anything away, was all a clue to what he was thinking and the reveal that we get at the end.
Well, Ryan, let me ask you. I feel like you've seen the movie multiple times. Do you feel like they sort of did that where, literal translation of what Nam is saying into English kind of gives them one sense of answers, but watching it a second or third time, knowing that he really just wants to blow up that door, do you think that they did a good job being like, oh, wow, what he's saying might translate this way, but I think he might also be, speaking for himself what his goal is?
It's very interesting. Rewatching it, there's a lot of different things in terms of the journey that every character goes on in this film, and it speaks a lot on the structure. I do think, to answer your question, it is a little bit more apparent that he has an alternative agenda. I think that's even the case. They really show that early on. They really hint to that early on when he comes out of the isn't he in like a little cabin when he comes out? So, I do think upon rewatch, it is clear that there are alternative motives. However, one thing that is for sure is that the structure of the movie in terms of going to each room, and it's just another spot. It's another task or obstacle for each room they go in, and they all have different environments. It's so cool. It really mirrors that of like a Willy Wonka, in that every room is different, and in that structure you can go into the characters in Willy Wonka, each have alternative motives. You know, like the TV guy has his own motive. Veruca wants, she just wants the golden goose. Like there's different things, and I think if you kind of parallel these two movies in terms of the characters' motives, you're going to find a lot of similarities.
And, kind of going off of that too, what I found interesting is that we started off at the back of the train with, people who they had just picked up, who they considered the lower class, right? So then we move along, and as we move along, it seems to be that we are kind of increasing in class, and then we get to the the high society class. But then what I found the most fascinating is it kind of went back down, because we went from what they would have considered high class society to all of a sudden, here we're with the people who are doing chronal and the club scene, and
you get to the hashtag rich kids of Instagram basically as you get to the front, because they're the ones that were the most affluent, but they're probably the worst people, just sort of, what their motivation is in life. Yeah.
And it almost felt like with different, so like, we had people who were struggling to survive at the back. In the front, we also had people struggling to survive, but in an entirely different way. Instead of, they don't have food, when we got to the front, it was more like, no, it's like two different extremes, and they're struggling emotionally because they can't handle everything that's happening to them in a different, like more of an intellectual way, in an emotional way.
Want to shout out Yash in the chat. Is wondering if people prefer Snowpiercer to Parasite. He says Snowpiercer was seared into his brain, and also visually it's outstanding, which I completely agree. And Chris Evans was so good. He's always good. All the acting in this movie is great. I think you have some great performances. And I didn't know the cast list well enough to know who was playing Wilfred. So I figured it was going to be a very recognizable, Western, as in, American or British actor. And the reveal that it was Ed Harris, I'm like, oh yeah, this seems kind of perfect.
To answer his question too about which movie we prefer, I think I personally like Parasite better, only because I thought that this movie was amazing, and I hate to even compare them at all, because this movie definitely stands up really well on its own. The reason I would argue that Parasite spoke more to me, though, is because it was more about one single family and their struggles trying to kind of climb up a social ladder. So
right. I mean, you're dealing with a lot of different people trying to make a similar climb. But before we get into some of the things about the film itself, give us your thoughts on Ed Harris as Wilfred.
Yeah. So I think my big thing is I'm still debating in my head whether his story about Gilliam was true or not.
Yeah, I was going to ask you that. Yeah.
Ed Harris as the actor playing Wilfred, though, I thought was perfect.
Yeah.
Because he was very level-headed, and like you never knew, like he doesn't seem like your typical like megalomaniac who is power hungry. He just almost seems like a regular person in a way.
Who wears pajamas all day.
Yeah.
And the only other person that we ever knew who wore pajamas all day was Hugh Hefner. So I thought that was a nice touch, because he's like, well, who am I getting dressed up for? Her? No.
But it was interesting because here's a guy, like, he's under the impression that the system is going to keep going the same way it always does, and that everything is always going to remain in balance, and there's always going to be a certain amount of people, and it's just going to keep going. And the thing is that, clearly what he doesn't recognize is that the system can be broken.
Right, exactly. I think the desire of Curtis, and also, Nam, who he was, I don't think, prepared for, his plan. I don't think he would imagine, like, why would Curtis not want this? This is so much better. And Curtis even says everybody in the back would gladly trade places with you. And he's almost like, funny you mentioned that, because I want to trade places with you. And sort of the realization, I guess, of the kids working to actually clean the engine and all of that, I think helped him kind of realize, because he clearly, I mean, it's obviously like, well, the rest of our lives we're still going to be on this train. That's at least Curtis's point of view. So the notion, so Wilford's offer had to seem at least somewhat appealing on some level to him.
And I think that Curtis was about to take him up on that offer, which is kind of ironic, because the whole thing was that Curtis wanted to get up there and wanted to overthrow Wilford so that he could change the system. And I think that what Curtis realized at the end of the film was, we're not going to be able to keep this train going and accomplish what I wanted to and change things. The only way it changes is if we destroy this. Yeah. And I think that was kind of what was going on in Curtis's mind near the end was, okay, I either take over this person's place and we keep doing what we're doing, and that's just the way it's going to be, or everybody has to die, because there's no way to, keep this train in motion and change at the same time. Like, those two things can't happen together. What I loved with Curtis, though, is that we had that moment where we learn about how Gilliam had actually ripped off his own arm and made that choice to stop Curtis from, doing the wrong thing. Yeah. And how Curtis said, well, I tried, but I could never rip my own arm off. And saving Timmy, his arm got ripped off.
Yes. I thought that was a great arc for Curtis, but also for Curtis's arm. You know, it's sort of, it actually was able to see, it's like, well, now I have the reason that I need to give this arm away. But he couldn't necessarily see it, and that just reinforces what Gilliam said about him being a different person. Before we try to interpret what the ending was, we have to obviously talk about the character of Yona, who is Nam's daughter, portrayed by Goa Sung. At least I hope I got that right. And I thought that she was great. I mean, she's largely, at least when we first see her, just sort of an ancillary character just with Nam. And then we start to kind of, get to see, she has questions. She's trying to figure things out. And I think she does a great job. And I really liked seeing them work together. What did you think of her? And just what did you think of her first?
I love how they portray the train babies, as they called them. Anyone actually born on the train. I kind of assumed she would be. I didn't know what the ending was going to be. Yeah. But I kind of assumed that there was going to be some kind of major, end moment with her, where either her father didn't survive and she did, or she died. I was pretty convinced that all of them, except maybe Curtis, were going to die until a certain point.
Yeah, I was with you. Yeah.
With her, though, I also felt this sense of sadness, because here's this 17-year-old girl who is, kind of addicted to Cronol, and she's never known any other life but being on a train and, sleeping in that one little, incubator, whatever you want to call it. Yeah. Sleeping in that room with her dad. So she's never really known what it's like to really live.
So we basically focus on her after Nam's plan derails the train in fairly spectacular fashion, and we have both Nam and Timmy, who is Tanya's daughter, who was basically, that's who Curtis gave his arm for, was to get him out of the mechanism inside the engine of the train. And they go outside, and they of course don't die instantly. So that'll tell you that they're not in Antarctica. I don't know where. So they're they obviously have nice jackets, which helps.
I watched this with hubby Joe, and we were both like, okay, apparently she had grabbed the jacket from someone, but we were curious about the smaller
Timmy size jacket.
Yeah, but we assumed they went back and grabbed it.
I do wonder if that was like like an insert shot where they're like, do we really need that? You know? Because I know I did think like, wait, it's not like it's her dad's jacket just draped around him. You know, it's like, oh no, that's a child-sized jacket.
Looks like it's fit perfectly for him.
Had that? Yeah, exactly. Well, there was a tailor on the train, so maybe they had it made and then they had it delivered. So what do you think about as they walk off into the snow and they see the polar bear, which I think was a nice reveal?
So my thought was, one, I'm not convinced that the only survivors are the people that were on this train.
Right.
And the thing is, I understand polar bears, like, you know, obviously they have a fur coat. They are more equipped to bear cooler temperatures. But what I'm assuming is that we had people on a train. There were probably shelters that did house other people. So I'm convinced that that Timmy and Yona are not the last two survivors of the human race. But two, I do think that it is ending on a hopeful note, even though there is a polar bear, and that may mean other polar bears and might mean their death. But
it just might be, you know, just other people in general. And I thought the polar bear actually has sort of has an expression of like, what are these?
Yeah,
you know, it's never seen people. So I don't know. I thought that was cool. Finish that thought. I wanted to talk about awards before we run out of time.
No, I'm just going to add too that. I do think generally speaking, it ends on kind of a happy note that it doesn't. But I think the ultimate message wasn't so much of was one that yes, the human race is going to survive, but two, the message that it sometimes like we have to break a system in order to survive, and that just because you're trapped on a train or trapped in a certain, you know, way of life does not mean that you are stuck there forever. There is always a way to change it.
Right. I definitely agree with that. I thought it had a nice sort of open ending where, you know, it's up to interpretation, which I think is always fun for a movie because it's not like, well, this is definitely what happened. It's like, no, because you have no idea where it goes from there. And it always makes it fun to talk about. So talk a little bit in our final 2 minutes here about some of the awards it was nominated for, it did receive, and because I know that you had some notes on that.
Yeah, so it looks like Snowpiercer did not receive any American awards, but it looks like they received the Grand Bell Award for Best Art Direction in 2013, the Blue Dragon Film Award for Best Art Direction, the Blue Dragon Film Award for Best Director, the Baek Sang Arts Award for Best Film Director in 2014, and then the Grand Bell Award for Best Editing in 2013. So
yeah,
did pretty well.
You know, we talked about its $40 million budget, and its international box office is $86 million, which, you know, if a Marvel movie opened at $86 million, they would really, you know, hit panic over at Disney. But I think for a movie like this, that's great.
Yeah.
You know, and so I think it was received very well in that sense too. What we always like to do when we do these anatomy movies, you know, sort of, does it live up to the hype? This didn't have hype in a traditional way. Like a lot of the movies we've done are sort of like classics, and we're just, you know, usually Alexa and I have just been dumb enough to have not seen them. But this, I think, is like, oh, you can see why this movie is so widely regarded, and it's also not particularly old, so it's not going to feel like, I don't know what they were thinking back then. But what did you think about sort of the reputation this film has now that you've seen it?
It made me appreciate Bong Joon-Ho as a director even more. And now I want to go out. I haven't seen all of his movies, so now I want to just like go and binge everything that he's ever done. But it made me appreciate him more as a director. I also appreciated the cast and the way that everybody worked. It was definitely an ensemble piece.
Yeah, it was a great ensemble piece.
Yeah.
I agree, yeah.
And just the messages, and I appreciated all the hidden meanings and some of the meanings that weren't so hidden either.
Yeah, no. It's you know, there's a clear message at the middle, and you know, at the center of the entire crisis that they try to combat. We're in no way beaten over the head by it. You know, it's just sort of it's very apparent. Honestly, your Save the Planet image that you talked about at the beginning of the show that's frozen over. That's kind of it.
Yeah.
That's really what they're trying to say, and it's like, well, then you get stuck on a train. Yeah, I thought it was great, and I'm glad that I've seen it, and. I look forward to whatever we're going to see next week. I'm not quite sure what movie we're going to watch next week. I don't know who my co-host will be. But in 2 weeks, Rachel will be back. Alexa will be back, and we'll be watching Stripes, but that's 2 weeks. Follow me on social media if you want to know what we are watching next week. You can find me on Twitter and Instagram at ChristianDMZ. And Rachel, where can people find you?
You can find me on Twitter at Rach Goodman, or on my author Instagram account at Rachel Radner Author. If you are a fan of Stumptown, we do the after show on Wednesday nights, and I also am on the Young and the Restless after show panel and Doctor Who, and with Christian, we're on the Curb Your Enthusiasm panel too.
And final shameless plug, Thursday at 9 p.m. Pacific will be the first after show for Star Trek Picard. We'll be reacting to the series premiere, so look for that Thursdays at 9. It will be myself and the entire panel from Star Trek Discovery. Anyway, that's all the time we have now. Until next week, we will see you at the movies.
From producers Maria Menounos, Kevin Undergaro, and the entire Popcorn Talk Network, we would like to thank you for tuning in. For questions or comments, be sure to visit popcorntalk.com. I'm Sir Richard Wentworth, and this has been a presentation of the Popcorn Talk Network.